Hello, everyone. Welcome to Collection 3.0, the podcast by laCollection. I am Marlène Corbun, the head of contemporary art for laCollection, and I'm very delighted to welcome today Kalen Iwamoto, who is our special host and who we have in a group show that I am co-curating with Fanny Lacoubé on the topic on art and currency. The show will be live on the platform in December, and we are really excited to launch it. Then, first question for you, Kalen. Can you tell me more about you as an artist and how did you get started into Web3?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm a conceptual crypto writer and artist. I started minting in early 2021. And like with so much of what I do, actually, I have my husband to thank for my introduction to crypto. So he first discovered it in 2014 or so. We've been involved on and off since then. He was even mining, Dogecoin back in those days before Elon Musk discovered it. But unfortunately, we didn't fill our bags with ETH, and we sold all our Dogecoin. So we didn't really benefit from our early introduction to the crypto world. And in fact, it was only when we discovered the art side of things through NFTs, sometime in 2020, that I truly dived in and decided to stay for the long haul. So my husband's also an artist. And so this really, the whole NFT and art side of things really grabbed our attention. And ironically, it's what really made us discover kind of the revolutionary nature of, the technological and sociopolitical and economic implications of the blockchain as a technology. So in 2020, my husband and I started out as collectors, and we explored the space and collected, what we could afford, which wasn't very much back then. But I was really enthralled by this whole movement and this whole revolution, really. And so I was really excited by all the possibilities, really, that I felt compelled to start creating and minting myself in early 2021. And my practice since then has really been about exploring what we can do with poetry and with text, with creating a new kind of conceptual art and writing that can only happen on the blockchain. My first series, for example, which is called Few Understand, is a chained micro autofiction series. In which the last sentence of one block is the first sentence of the next. So it was kind of inspired by the way the blockchain, like how the blocks are chained together on the blockchain itself. So that was my first entry into the NFT scene.
Well, very interesting. And also seeing you have this dynamic with your husband as an artist is quite powerful, I imagine. And you're one of the lucky ones to have been there at the beginning. Now I feel we're all catching up the trains.
Yeah, right.
But what I feel is like really interesting about your practice is that you are mixing poesy with blockchain, which seems uncanny at first. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you, how are you linking those two with harmony in your art practice?
Yeah, it is definitely quite uncanny because we have this kind of image of poetry being this old kind of highfalutin, almost esoteric literary form that's almost stands in very stark contrast to kind of this fast-paced tech world. But this is an incongruity that also at theVERSEverse we're trying to dismantle. So, for example, and we can get into that a bit later, maybe, but in my own work, I myself don't actually practice the kind of usual lyrical style of poetry. So that I think in itself, I think is not kind of the usual, it's a departure from the conventional notions of poetry already. And I was actually speaking with the curator, Jesse Damiani, not too long ago. And he said there were two kinds of writers. One kind who, you know, writes in the usual modes and molds, and others who go into a literary form and kind of breaks it apart and then puts it back together to create something a little different, something a little new. And he placed me in that second camp, which I thought was such a wonderful compliment. I just like break things apart. So yeah, I'm kind of coming into this, into poetry as a form with this kind of attitude. And it's not with really a sacrilegious intent, but it's just that I'm coming into poetry, and not just poetry, because you know, I also write in all sorts of different literary forms and break those apart as well. But with poetry also, I have this kind of hunger to explore and experiment and play. And a lot of my experimentations happen to be stoked by this excitement around this new blockchain technology and what it can do to and for poetry. So, and I'm also very much inspired by this notion of crossing over, and of any notion really with the prefix like trans, like so transmedia, translation, transaction, you know, transdisciplinarity. There's something interesting, I think, that happens when you cross over from one idea or field or language to another. And there's necessarily a kind of transformation that happens, I think, in that liminal space between two distinct domains. And that's the kind of space that I like to dwell in. That space in between two things that already exist, with an established form and an identity, and with concomitant rules and ideas and processes. And in that crossing over, because things are no longer fixed in that space, there's a lot of room to play and rearrange and rethink and reimagine everything that's already been established. So this is really where I thrive. So bringing together poetry and the blockchain to me feels very natural. But yeah, you asked for an example of how I'm linking the two, and obviously there's this series that I've created for laCollection, which we'll get into later, I'm sure. But another, I guess, very obvious example was one of I think it was the first poetry the first poem I minted back in 2020. And this one is called 12. The poem is called 12, and it brought together poetry and the blockchain in kind of a fun, playful way. So what I did with this project, for example, was I created a new wallet, and I used the 12 seed words of that wallet to create a poem. So there were these 12 words to unlock this wallet buried within this poem. And I also asked 12 of my crypto writer friends to send one of their literary NFTs to this new wallet. So it was full of all these beautiful, you know, interesting and very early examples of crypto literature. And then I wrote clues to find the 12 seed words from the poem and place that in the unlockable content of the NFT, so that the collectors of the poem could decipher the seed phrase. Excuse me. And it was like a crypto literary, you know, treasure hunt. And the first person to find the 12 words can open the wallet and take all the NFTs inside. And I was really pleased with this project because the collectors were so engaged, and they were really, I think they had a lot of fun throughout the process. And yeah, that was really nice to see.
I also feel like I would have loved to play that game, really. And you're right. What is super interesting in your practice is the way you use the language of the blockchain and the language of words and find this intermediary creation by adding the two. And so basically, when Jesse Damiani is putting you in the conceptual kind of writer, it's totally echoing what we see also in the series that we will discuss later on. It's not that much about, I mean, it's about the words, but it's more about the concept around the words. Exactly. Than the words in themselves somehow.
Exactly.
And And thank you for giving this example. I will have a look more at this project. But we know, Kalen, that you are also a co-founder of theVERSEverse. Mm-hmm. And I wanted you to tell us more about what it is about, what is the purpose of it, and how are you interacting with that entity?
Yeah, sure. So I'm one of the co-founders of theVERSEverse, which is a literary NFT gallery focused on poetry. I created the gallery with two other poets in November of last year, in 2021. The two poets are Ana Maria Caballero and Sasha Stiles. We actually met through a poetry collective called Ether Poems, which was launched last year and spearheaded by kind of an influencer, art chick. And she brought these poets together, and we released a collection of poetry called Ether Poems. And so that's where we met, and where we kind of built this idea for theVERSEverse. And one of our missions at theVERSEverse is to raise the financial valuation of poetry so that it starts to kind of meet its cultural and artistic value. And, you know, because there's this trope of the starving poet, and there is no such thing as a poet without a second job, because it would just absolutely does not pay to just simply sell your poetry. And we think that that's absolutely aberrant, and there's something wrong with the situation. So, you know, we're trying to advocate, you know, the selling of poetry so that poets can actually maybe perhaps one day live off of their craft. And we're also interested in experimenting with poetry, and to kind of lift poetry off the page and to experiment with what it can be and what it can do when it meets the blockchain technology, and when it meets, you know, video poetry, digital poetry, to experiment with all these new tools, like with AI, for example. Sasha Stiles is one of the pioneers of kind of generative poetry in the space. So we like to invite poets, for example, from the traditional poetry world, and to experiment and to play with AI and to create poetry and co-write with AI. And so we like to encourage this kind of experimentation as well in the poetry world. So yeah, that's a little bit about theVERSEverse. Yeah.
And to link this conversation with Web3, do you think that actually Web3 and NFT as a format is supporting the project of theVERSEverse, but also your project as an artist?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Oh, yeah. At theVERSEverse, the transactability of poems, thanks to blockchain technology and through NFTs, is what enables us enables poets to make money, instead of, you know, selling, poetry collection that gets published and, you know, it is bought by so few people, and even when it's sold, they earn so little of the royalties. So absolutely, in terms of the financial valuation of poetry, that's absolutely key at theVERSEverse. The NFTs as a medium is absolutely key. So, for example, at theVERSEverse, I think using NFTs as a medium of distribution, I think can be absolutely revolutionary for poetry in general, and for individual poets more specifically. And I think for my personal practice, I really like to think of NFTs also as not just a means of distribution, but also as a means of creation. So really integrating what blockchain technology can do, what smart contracts can do, what the wallets are, and, you know, this whole ecosystem around and within Web3, and as well as kind of the new language and the syntax that's being created around and within NFTs and in Web3. I'd like to use all of these things and kind of use them as inspiration or to feed the work, so that what comes out kind of feels very native to the Web3 space.
And actually, speaking of the Web3 space, as Miami just finished a couple of days ago, I wanted to speak about how the theVERSEverse was actually all over the place in this Web3 ecosystem. So it feels that you have a strong voice, and that poetry and the blockchain really have a strong potential. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be at Miami, but we were very ably represented by Anna Maria and Sasha Stiles, and also our community manager, Elizabeth Sweet. And they were really all over the place. They were running around town, speaking and exhibiting, and it was a really, really exciting moment for us. And I think there really is great potential for poetry on the blockchain. And I think it's been very interesting to see the kind of reaction that people have had to the theVERSEverse. And it almost feels like a revival of poetry, thanks to the blockchain. And, I've met more than a few artists and collectors actually who have said, I don't normally read poetry. And their last contact with poetry was, in high school. And in fact, often these people were almost turned away from poetry because of the sort of very scholastic and rigid vision of poetry that they were taught in high school. And then, they encounter a poem through the theVERSEverse or, through NFTs, and they have a different reaction to poetry, and they realize, oh, this is also poetry. This is what poetry can be. And it doesn't have to be, a kind of rigid form or kind of very academic and esoteric. So it really opens up what poetry is. And, it's a little bit unfortunate because in Web 1, Web 2 really revolutionized all sorts of different art forms like digital art, visual art, sampling. But I feel like literature and poetry kind of missed the boat a little bit with the digital revolution. And I feel like this is another chance. Yeah, so I think it's very exciting to see all these artists and collectors and readers encountering poetry and getting excited about it again. And so I think there's absolutely a huge potential for poetry on the blockchain, and also for a new kind of poetry as well, and a chance to breathe new life into poetry, which I think is very exciting.
Yes, I agree with you. It's very refreshing as well to see this medium like flourishing. And I also share with you the idea that blockchain is a way to put poetry in the spotlight, because it has, blockchain is also language. Behind there is this idea of language as well. So I feel like it's the meaning of the blockchain itself is just putting language back first. So it's something very, I found also very healthy for poetry art in general.
Absolutely. And I think it's actually very interesting.
Speaking about it,
Oh, sorry. I think it's also very interesting that text can be minted directly on chain, unlike digital art, which needs to be linked through IPFS. And so in the end, when if something ever happens, it'll be the on-chain text that will be, forever. And it's the most endurable form that actually exists, in fact, ironically.
Yes, no, but you're right. So it's making language really powerful for that medium, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking about it and about powerful art, you have created for our show on art and currency a series that is called Coining Poetry. And I would like to dig a bit into that subject. So could you describe the series in more details and your concept behind the project?
Of course, yes. So for laCollection, I created the Coining Poetry series, and basically I created a poem, a conceptual poem, in which there are 7 words, and each word was created using the constraints of a vanity address, so a customized wallet. And so each word was written within the constraints given by this form of the ETH address, which means that I only use the letters from A to F and the numbers 0 and 1, which I used as O's and L's. And each vanity address, I actually created those addresses and those wallets. And inside each of these wallets, I transferred 1,000 poetry coins. So specifically for this collection, I created a new token called poetry coins, and sent each wallet 1,000 of these coins. So I think this whole series is really an experiment about what will happen to the coins, because in crypto, you never really know what happens to tokens. And I mean, it's not really worth anything really, but, we never know, I guess.
And we look forward to see actually what's going to happen with those tokens.
Exactly.
But you've also made a physical part for each of those works with a physical wallet.
Yes.
And what will it be about?
So the physical component is kind of the physical counterpart to the digital wallets and the digital tokens. So what I did was I took a transparent wallet. It's kind of like a coin purse, really. And so you can see the contents of it, which for me is the equivalent to a crypto wallet, which is, it's public. Anyone can see the contents of what's inside your wallet. And inside this transparent purse, physical purse, there's going to be a piece of paper on which I handwrite the poem that I created for the collection, and hand signed as well. And the coin purse will be labeled with the wallet of the corresponding address.
It's amazing. I really look forward to see those. And I feel like in the digital space, we also tend to see more and more physical elements because people appreciate the link with physicality. And it's true that it's in our project as well about coins. There is this idea of materiality when we speak about currency. So it's really amazing that you've added that element for collectors.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really interested actually in this bridge. Like I mentioned earlier about crossing over. That's one of the things that I like the 2 elements that I like to bring together is like the physical and the digital and how those can be meaningfully brought together. So this was really fun to do.
And going back to the series in itself, so the words you've created within the constraints of the wallet construction, why did you particularly choose those words? What meaning do they have to you and for this topic of art and money?
Yeah, so the words are definitely not random. They have a very specific meaning, and it's actually a self-referential poem. So it refers to the series itself. I can quickly go through each of the kind of phrases. So there are 3 parts to the poem. The poem is coded label, fabled deal, dole of dole. And coded label refers to the project itself, and effectively this self-referentiality of the poem, which talks about and sheds light on the meaning of the entire series. So, these are labels that are in code. So each of these 3 parts are kind of have coded meaning that refers to itself. And fabled deal hinges on this double meaning of the word fabled. And so it also refers to the kind of two possible outcomes of the so-called deal of receiving this poetic currency. So on the one hand, fabled means, of course, fictitious, so something that's not true, but it also means famous. Something that's very storied and people have written about. And so the poetic currency faces, the poetry coin faces these two possible fates. So either the currency will forever remain worthless, and so the deal is in fact no deal at all, and therefore kind of fictitious, because there's no kind of lucrative bargain involved. But we also never know what might happen to this currency. Like I said before, we never know what happens in the crypto world. In the off chance that it does become worth something, then maybe this series will become a kind of a famous transaction in which the collector gets both the art and free money that's actually worth something. So the fabled deal kind of refers to this indeterminacy of the tokens, of the value of the tokens. And finally, dole of dole. So dole also has kind of a double meaning. Dole means free money. So to dole out, is to distribute. It can kind of mean like benefits, government benefits, for example, in the UK. But in the archaic kind of literary meaning of dole is fate or destiny. So dole of dole is a kind of question about the eventual destiny or fate of this freely distributed currency that's unleashed into the world through these wallets that will soon belong to the collectors. So this element of experimentation, of a big question mark of this fate of this currency, of releasing this currency into the world, and just seeing what happens and what becomes of it. So yeah, the poem itself is kind of refers to this whole project and what it kind of means to me, and the sense of experimentation with tokens, and the value of tokens, which is we don't really know.
I love that experimental side of it, because yes, there are so many layers in this series that you've created. And speaking of the tokens, I wanted to ask you if those poetry tokens, those thousands that will be distributed, are they also somehow for you asking the question of what is the value of poetry today for our society?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it was kind of to create a token or currency called poetry in this day and age when, poetry is, when you think of poetry, like we talked about earlier, poetry isn't worth anything in financial terms. So it's, I wouldn't say it's really a joke, but it's kind of like a spin. It turns on this notion that poetry lacks financial value, but it also questions this notion. So this is kind of linked to the work that we're doing in the VERSEverse about raising the financial valuation of poetry, and asking why shouldn't poetry also be worth something, just like art is. Art is a very lucrative field, and not for all individual artists, but art is an investment, of course, for many people. So yes, absolutely. It's asking these questions about this link between money and financial value of poetry. And this, like I just said, I mentioned art as an investment. I mean, that notion is kind of hypercharged and accelerated in the NFT space, where there's a lot of gambling and there's a lot of flippers and, people out to make a quick buck. And the NFT market is so closely tied to the financial crypto market. And, crypto started as a financial concept. And so necessarily NFTs are linked to that and closely, very, very inextricably tied, I would say. So this question of art not just poetry, but art and currency, is kind of inescapable in the NFT world, I think. And it's something that all NFT artists kind of have to grapple with in their own way. So this series also plays out this inextricable connection that's kind of, it's almost impossible to disentangle in the NFT art scene. And in this project, I'm kind of making it almost like brazenly explicit, this connection between currency and art and poetry. So yeah.
Well, wonderful. I feel like, as you say, the market is has been a lot speculative, but step by step we are seeing more traditional habits coming in, and people collect. I mean, a lot of people collect also with their heart. So I believe that those kinds of concepts are very powerful today to kind of change the art market and bring new medium to the space, and where poetry has its space and should take more space. So thank you so much, Kalen, for telling us about your works, for telling us about poetry today, and yes, and how it should be a strong and powerful art medium supported by the blockchain. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to the audience for listening. And if you'd like to learn more about Kalen and her works, be sure to visit the links in the episode description. See you next time, everyone.
Thank you.